Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out the radio version of the show every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern on WDJY 99.1 in Atlanta. We also air on a podcasting network in Los Angeles called the 405 Media. There's a TV version of the show that airs on KMVT 15 in Silicon Valley at 8 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday nights. Both versions of the show air in other states. For these show times, plus past episodes, please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Chris Denson. He's the director at Ignition Factory and the host of the Innovation Crush podcast. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think what you've done and are currently doing is actually really innovative and cool, but maybe before we kind of get into all that fun stuff, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Yeah, I was born in a manger. No, I grew up in, I was born in a manger. No, sure. I wasn't, I promise. No, I grew up in Detroit, so just kind of like my hometown was growing up in the, in the city, in the suburbs, and, eventually went to Michigan State and studied engineering.
Okay. What made you want to take engineering, just out of curiosity?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I think a lot of times when you ask like a 17-year-old kid what they want to do for the rest of their lives, I get the sense that most of us don't really know, right?
Sure. Do we ever really know?
Exactly. Even 40-years don't know what they want to do. So I think I studied something that I felt like, okay, I would have a job. It was job security.
Okay.
It was packaging engineering. There were only 3 schools in the country that offered the degree. It didn't involve a lot of it wasn't too sciencey for me. Like I liked physics, but I didn't want to figure out circuits and frequencies and, all the stuff that you would have to do in other engineering fields. So I was like, all right, well, if there's only 3 schools in the country that offer the degree and every company that manufactures a product, they put it in some sort of package, right? So
sure.
All right, therein lies some job security. But at the same time, I think when I went to school, I started doing stand-up comedy.
Okay.
And so that really kind of became my passion and my focus for a very long time. And, there was an early part of my career for about 6 or 7 years where I was doing stand-up pretty consistently and was on television and, won some competitions and so on and so forth. And then slowly meandered into writing. It was just creating full-blown concepts for films and television and sketches and kind of today I just combine both of those worlds. A lot of my ideas are rooted in puns. Or at the very least, it's instead of engineering, transmissions and engines, I'm engineering ideas for brands and businesses. So, and I try to have a good time while I do it.
Sure. So walk me through a little bit of your career. You kind of quickly covered it, but walk me through kind of some of the stuff that you did in your career, maybe some career highlights, because you've done tons of stuff up until kind of what you're doing today.
Well, no, it's been a fun journey. A lot of what I've been able to do have either been a part of a first or the job is creating a first. And I'll give you a couple examples. My first writing job in Hollywood was on BET. And it was their first attempt. Yeah, thank you. But it was their first attempt at a late night talk show. So it was literally a blank canvas, right? There was no formula. We crafted the show from soup to nuts. What segments were going to be interviews, what segments were going to be sketches, or writing jokes for monologues. It was just a blank slate. I didn't go into an established environment like it was Jay Leno. And here's segment 1 through 6 on this show. It was all right, let's make this up as we go. So not only was I, able to exercise some humor, it was also just creative development, right? And then, slowly kind of just still keeping a foot in the entertainment industry. Eventually, I took a job at the American Film Institute and helping run their digital content lab. Along the way, especially working as a freelancer in the entertainment business, you sometimes get to wear a lot of different hats, right? You get to make a project. Now we have to figure out how to market it, or you're talking to producers, or you're talking to the networks people about just different ideas. And so I found that I was pretty decent at, marketing and concepting around marketing. But eventually, like I said, gravitated toward the American Film Institute, and the Digital Content Lab was a hugely sought after think tank for marriages of technology and entertainment. And so, we worked with everybody from the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation to building the first in-browser game on the PlayStation.
Wow.
To like future forward prototyping. We would build out these things that were anywhere from 25 to 75% functional.
Okay.
And there were only 4 of us who ran the lab, but, we would cycle through these projects with volunteer mentors from all over the world. So, I met Nolan Bushnell there. I met Bill Duke. I just met all these really amazing individuals. I'm like, wow, these people exist, and they do this kind of smart stuff. And, suddenly it just kind of blew the lid off of, at least for me, what possibility was when it came to sort of marrying these two worlds. I think over time, it's just, it starts to really, when I'm doing stand-up comedy, my job is to observe culture and translate it into some creative output for an audience. And I think it's the same thing that I do now, right? And it's like observing culture, what's happening in, technology infrastructures, or just social activism, or, anything. Parenting could be a good place to source, inspiration and opportunity.
No, I 100% agree, man. That's actually really cool. And you've sat on some kind of pretty big kind of boards, right? Like you've done some stuff with kind of the White House, South by Southwest, and some other kind of TV networks. Like, how did you kind of get involved in some of that stuff?
I guess I'm just a nosy guy. I'd like to think that I'm good at what I do, but a lot of it also is just like knocking on doors. You'd be surprised. At least if you have at least somewhat of a decent resume. When you tell somebody you want to do X, Y, and Z, or we've heard it all in like Tim Ferriss books, like go to the top, ask the CEO. You kind of do your job of networking, right? I think most of us think of our job as a thing that we do on a daily basis, when you're sitting behind your computer. But, from a personal brand or just the personal desire to expand standpoint, it's really like an ability to connect dots. I don't have a lot of socio-political personal experience, but, when the opportunity came up with the White House, it was a guy I met at an event, and we just really hit it off. And then, we got to the what do you do part of the conversation. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. And he's like, well, the Global Entrepreneurship Summit is coming up. And he happened to be one of the people that put it together, a young guy. So it wasn't like it was some, stodgy man in the suit. It was just like somebody I really vibed with.
Sure.
And we saw the world the same way. And, in the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, and that was 2 years ago. They do it every year, but, I did it under the Obama administration.
Sure.
And it was amazing, right? To just go there and sort of, just be a listening ear for a lot of these entrepreneurs from all over the world, and really get involved with the civic infrastructure for building companies and ideas. And you've got brands in the room, and it's just a really interesting environment. And I think you do one of those, right? You do something like that, and you just kind of like
snowballs a bit.
Keep riding. Yeah. Keep riding the wave a little bit. So South by Southwest Accelerator is another one. For the last 3 years, I've just kind of, helped steer that effort and pick startups and judges and all sorts of stuff. Similarly with the Google Launchpad, which is their international accelerator.
Sure.
I'll go up to San Francisco a couple of times a year and, sit with 40 startups from 30 different countries over the course of 4 days, and the executives from Google who are leading this thing, and kind of just help steer the direction of it. There's a few more, but, I think it's kind of rinse and repeat after that, especially depending on how much time is available in a day. So
sure.
That's always the other fun part.
But I think that's really good advice in itself, right? Like, you never know who you're going to meet at these events, right? And I'm a big believer, like, I live up in Canada, right? So obviously I'm not in necessarily a big kind of known tech hotbed of whatever, but the thing that's really, I think, interesting about what kind of we get to do now as kind of the internet kind of generation is there's not really any borders, and you have the ability to go to maybe one or two events a year in a big city that you could fly to, you know, that's maybe 2-3 hour flight where you never know who you're going to meet at these things. And not saying you shouldn't be involved in your kind of your local community, but if you really wanted to break into some of these bigger markets, you don't necessarily need to always live in these kind of big cities. Like, obviously, you're in LA, correct? That's where you live?
Yep.
Obviously, the White House isn't in kind of Los Angeles, but you got to kind of be involved in that, and South by Southwest is in Austin, and, you know, you don't live in San Francisco, so you met somebody somewhere, and you kind of been traveling throughout North America to be a part of different events, which I think is kind of inspiring and can just get people maybe thinking that are listening to the show. It's like you don't necessarily need to live in these like big hubs to be involved in some really cool stuff happening in a lot of cities across North America or the world.
Yeah, no, I agree. You know, I'm a big fan of putting yourself in different vocational environments as well as geographic environments. So,
sure.
You know, one example is like I worked at Machinima for a number of years. It was a giant, you know, YouTube network for fanboys and gamers and so on and so forth. And I barely knew a game title, let alone you know what the culture was like. But it was definitely like a deep dive, right? You jump into this culture, and suddenly you're exposed to different, you know, points of view, different experiences, and then your ignorance. I'll call it that. Like if you're unfamiliar.
No, I think that's good though.
Yeah, it is true. But it's also like you walk in and you're also bringing value.
Sure.
Because you're also bringing a different perspective. So I think that's where I enjoy the most collisions, is where I'm in a space where I was like, oh, what you guys do that here? Like, you know, I can go to a marketing conference all day or a digital marketing conference or whatever it is. And like, all right, same people I see all the time. Like, there's value in reconnecting with those individuals, but there's also like value in, I don't even remember I'm trying to remember where I met Bert from the White House, but it definitely wasn't at my normal, you know, circle of influence.
Sure.
Right. I was trying to just get outside myself, and this always has, and not everybody can afford to travel, you know, multiple times a year, but I think it's, you know, meetup.com, Eventbrite as a website is great for just sourcing weird stuff. Go to the medical conference, go to the, you know, the pet adoption conference, or the meetup or whatever, and you'll find that like your skills become a value in an environment where everybody else kind of, it's a homogenous group of individuals talking to themselves. You become the unique thing that's standing out.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. Like, not everybody can afford to travel. That's fair. And I think there's a lot of cool events potentially happening in a lot of cities, you know, across wherever, right? Like anywhere on the globe that you could be. You never know who you're going to meet. But how did you kind of get your job at Machina?
How did I get that job? I think, you know, I was, I don't know, like I'm really one of those guys where it's like, if something just sounds kind of interesting, if it sounds at the core like something that I'm good at. So they had just launched a new department, or wanted to, called Creative Solutions, which is basically like an agency within the company.
Okay.
So if Pepsi came to the table, or whatever brand wanted to do something on the network, we would be the go-to group to figure out what that is, whether it's online, offline, you know, whatever. So I'm just bringing sort of my transferable skill, which is, creative idea development, to a new space. And so went in for meeting number 1, which turned into meeting numbers 3 through 8 or whatever, you know, meeting everybody up to the CEO.
Sure.
And just really, you know, just being confident, but, you know, asking the right questions. You know, I saved a lot of the dumb questions for after I got the job.
Nice.
But I wasn't. But, you know, I think they knew that was coming. They knew there was going to be a slew of dumb questions. They were like, look, I don't know everything about this, but here's what I'm good at. You know, here's what I do understand about this culture. Here's what I've researched, you know, up until now. Here's an individual or a person or thing that I've done that's kind of tangential to that. And that was kind of it, you know. I got to go in there and like assemble a team. That was kind of one of my first times assembling what I refer to as like the A-team model, right? So you got Hannibal, B.A. Baracus, Space. You've got all these different individuals who, have different sorts of skills. And we've worked on everything from product development and like, what does Machinima look like on Roku, or how do we better manage content flow internally, or better manage our relationships with influencers, as well as, hey, here's how, Pepsi can impact Latin America through the Machinima ecosystem. So there's a lot of different angles, and I think that ability to sort of deliberately think outside the box or just not even be inside the box kind of comes in handy.
No, that's great, man. That's really cool. So you started kind of Innovation Crush. It's the podcast that does kind of, 750,000 plus a month kind of listeners. Like, how did you kind of decide to start that up, and what do you guys kind of talk about?
Like I mentioned, I had this background in stand-up comedy, and actually, funny enough, when I was at Machinima, there was somebody to just have ridiculous hallway banter with. We would just like kind of crack each other up, but neither one of us would break, so it would just sound like a ridiculous conversation. And then she goes, "We should do a podcast." And this is kind of like before podcasting was like it is today.
Sure.
Like, well, whatever. And by the fourth time, she asked me, she goes, "I can get us set up in the studio to do it." And so I ended up going like that Friday, and we recorded this basically like a morning radio kind of banter. We actually called the show Reckless Breakfast.
Okay,
and,
nice.
Which is still available. It's still online if you guys want to look it up.
Awesome.
And it was definitely not informative and insightful like an Innovation Crush is, if I can save myself.
Sure.
But it was a good practice, and like, oh, cool. And there was a guy, I used to be director of innovation at a small agency called the Regan Group, and there was a guy who worked with me there who had left and started working for a podcast network.
Okay.
And so we were just catching up, and he was like, "Oh, I'm working at this podcast network," and I told him about that show, and he was like, "We do a whole bunch of stuff for comedic talent. We're kind of beefed up in that arena, but we've been looking to test other formats." Okay. And, as we started thinking about like what that would be, wanted to do a show about marketing. And I was like, well, once you do 2 episodes about how to market stuff, you kind of get it. But for me, it was like, where do smart marketers go for really good creative inspiration and insight? For me, that's always been Fast Company is one of my, top choices when it comes to that. So, to this day, I say the show is a cross between Fast Company and The Daily Show.
Okay.
And, we just like to have fun, but also extract really good left field creative from people you wouldn't expect to hear from. And even if it is somebody you've heard from 1,000 times, hopefully it's a different, perspective from that person. And part of it was also out of frustration. I was as an innovator, if I can call it that, because it's still not a role per se. My lens was always marketing, but I knew there was a bigger conversation to be had about what innovation really means. And as I was going to different companies after I left Machinima to talk to them about innovation agendas, they were like, "Oh, so you're a creative director?" And you're like, "Yeah, but not really." Like, "Oh, so you're the technology guy?" And you're like, "Sure." But eventually, I was like, "Look, I know dozens, if not hundreds, of people who are doing what I'm talking about. It's just not sort of mainstay practice in business right now."
Interesting.
So I decided to surround myself with those conversations, and pull in everybody from a Sugar Ray Leonard to Damian Kulash from OK Go to Cindy Gallup to a 9-year-old kid who raised $1.2 million for his French charity. All these people who are just like habitual rule breakers of some way, shape, or form.
No, I think that's really cool, man. I checked out obviously the podcast kind of before. I think that you've got like quite a wide gamut of guests that are all kind of in that kind of space, and that's actually quite fascinating to me, right? Like, and you've been doing it for what, 4.5 years now? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's about 4. I think just over 4. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's cool, man. So I'm curious though, how do you kind of inspire kind of others to kind of do this stuff? Because I think like this show even that we're talking about right now, like airs on some podcasting networks, and I'm sure you get asked all the time too, like, should they start a podcast or do that and or whatnot? And like, I would say like, go for it. And I kind of have this like templated email that I send, like, here's all the kind of gear I use and blah, blah, blah. And it's nothing crazy. Like, I think the mic I use is about $100 and software I use to record is like 30. So, you know, and then it goes from there if I'm recording live or whatnot. But, you know, it doesn't really necessarily need to cost a ton of money to like start up a podcast and have pretty good conversations with a lot of people, some that have done a lot of really cool things, or maybe some people that are starting out. So do you kind of think that it's a good idea for people to kind of get into the podcasting space, or what do you kind of think of the podcasting space in the industry right now?
I think it's up to the individual. You know, I think it's, you know, I mean, nobody knows your personality better than you do.
Sure.
Right? And, you know, it's a lot of it. And I've had very, very similar conversations, and I've sat with people for hours at a time and like given them all the gospel and, you know, that I could.
Sure.
And, you know, 6-8 months later, they haven't done anything with it.
Sure.
And there's other people who I talk to for like 10 minutes and, you know, 3 weeks later, they're up and running.
Yeah.
And it just depends on that individual. And if I think they actually did a podcast about podcasting. Okay. With a guy who started the LA Podcast Festival. He did a documentary on podcasting. He's a comedian. Graham Elwood is a great guy to know. But we were talking about, it's one of those things that's either grossly oversimplified or grossly overcomplicated.
Yeah,
like,
that's fair.
I got to book guests every week, and I got to do it, and it becomes overwhelming to that person. And the other person goes like, all you need is a mic and a computer. And you're like, well, it's not that easy either, right? It's somewhere in the middle. And just to be a good host. You know, for starters, when I started Innovation Crush, I never called it a podcast, right? I just kept saying I had an interview series. It's an interview series. I didn't want people to put it in a bucket in their minds, right? Whether it was conversational or not. You know, it's like kind of like saying you have a YouTube channel. You could be Logan Paul and be making millions of dollars a year. People are like, they got a YouTuber, right? Like there's a perception issue that happens. But as a host, it's like finding your voice, finding your cadence, finding those things that you're genuinely curious about, and especially if you're going to be asking questions to people. You know, it helps to not just do like, I'm going to do that. There's nobody done one in the fish tank market. I'm going to start the fish tank podcast. Like, if you don't care about fish or fish tanks or all that stuff, but you know, it's more of a business opportunity. You're not going to have the passion, and it'll show in the conversations you have.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know, so it's again, just kind of like either oversimplified or overcomplicated, depending on who's trying to do it.
So I'm curious then, because you've obviously done stand-up comedy in the past. Like, is it similar or totally different? Kind of actually being kind of interviewing. Like, I get when you're up on stage, you're kind of telling jokes, but you're interacting with the audience quite a bit, or potentially quite a bit. Is it pretty similar, or is it totally kind of different?
Both. It's both very similar, both very different. I mean, the for me, it's the spontaneity of the moment, right?
Okay,
you know, kind of like any other conversation, you never know where it's going to go. So people will tell you a surprise thing, or you'll spot an opportunity to make a joke, or you might say something that's like insensitive or considered insensitive, or what. Like, there's a number of things that can go right or wrong in this spontaneous live environment. And, you know, to like most stand-up routines, you're prepared to an extent, right? Like, you have a list of questions and talking points you want to go through with the guest. Sure. And you also have your standard questions that you probably ask everybody, and it's similar on a stage. You have like a library of jokes to pull from, and they're probably pretty scripted. But if Joe from Indiana decides to raise his hand and say something weird in the middle of your set, like, you can go there too. It's the ability to be both nimble and rigid in a moment, sure. And know where you want to get back to, and just like, even if I feel like I try to do all my interviews live, like in person. Okay. And I feel like that ability to read someone in a room. Like, I interviewed one woman. I won't tell you who it is.
Yeah, that's
but cool. She was very British.
Okay.
And we did it over Skype, and it was probably to this day I felt like one of my most difficult interviews.
Okay.
Because I don't think my humor was translating over the technology, but she was also very smart, and she was talking about something relatively serious, and so just the rhythm was off a little bit. But still, that. Even when I go back and listen to it, I get compliments on an interview, and I'm sure you probably go through this. You're like,
sure.
I really messed that one up. But to the audience, they don't really know the difference, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's actually a really interesting point because sometimes you're like, man, that was a terrible interview, and then somebody messages you like, that was awesome, and you're like, why? Right? You're like, okay, sure. Yeah, you're right. That's interesting.
I look at it almost like you do the music industry. Sometimes you hear that song on the radio and you're like, how is this song even popular? It's horrible, right?
Yeah, totally.
But something about it resonates with, audiences. But if I hear Despacito, I didn't like that song when it first came out, let alone, 43 million plays later. But I'm like, okay, if you guys like it, that's fine. And I think that even happens in creative crafts, right?
Sure.
Or in business. When startups pivot or companies pivot, and you're like, oh, we didn't know that was going to catch on. I guess we'll do more of that, right?
Yeah.
It's that unexpected surprise that you're like, okay, now I see what when I get, I interviewed Chameleonaire, the rapper who did Ride and Dirty, who happened to invest in Maker Studios and made a crap load of money and invested his money several times over, became entrepreneur in residence at the largest venture fund in Southern California, and just an amazing career.
Sure.
And one of the first, emails or messages I got about that interview was, hey, a friend of mine listened to this episode and quit smoking. I was like, okay.
You're like, what?
Was totally right. And, which was probably we talked about, he mentioned that he doesn't smoke or doesn't drink because he wants to stay clear. And he, even when he was heavily in the rap game, he didn't do it. And that was what that person resonated with. And so you find these surprising moments of anything you create, and then they're like, you got to be open to the surprise and really listen to what the market or the audience is telling you versus what you may innately want to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. And it is it's also rewarding though. When you probably got that email, you're like, you might not understand why, but you're like, hey, if it inspired you to do something, that's great, right?
Yeah.
So
I believe that at least when it comes to my interviews, or just even in projects we're doing for brands and clients, is every story is a human story.
Sure.
No matter I can tell you about the best activations at South by Southwest, but at the end of the day, that was designed for human beings to experience. And we are all emotional beings. We all want to be wild. We all have emotional ups and downs and all that stuff. And I think, really smart brands and smart experiences or smart content resonates with you in some way, whether it makes you laugh because it's funny because it's true, right? You can laugh about a divorce because it's hilarious, right?
Sure.
Because that person, resonated with something that was true in your own experience. And I think that's what happens. You look at the awards categories in Cannes and look at the winners, it's like, oh, these are really touching and heartwarming or just really smart. But at the same time, it's all still under the guise of storytelling. They're all human interest stories. So I find that a lot with my guests where it's, even the stuff that they create comes from a place that's very personal from them. Sure. I interviewed Miguel McKelvey, the founder of WeWork.
Sure.
And, come to find out, he grew up in community living.
Interesting.
Who would have thunk?
Totally.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
His mom and so it's no wonder WeWork is amazing because it comes from who he is, not necessarily a smart business idea, which those are valid too.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So you're the director at Ignition Factory. What exactly is that, and kind of how did you get involved with that originally?
Ignition Factory is a group within Omnicom Media. So Omnicom Media Group is the largest media agency in the world.
Yeah, they're huge.
We have about 10,000 employees around the world.
Wow.
And there's probably 20 of us kind of focused on innovation. And for the agency, that's kind of translates into emerging platforms and emerging culture.
Okay.
right? Like it's not all. I never say that innovation is synonymous with technology.
Okay.
Yes,
Sure.
there's a ton of that happening as well, but there's also just like, oh, people are doing this now. That's weird. Why is that happening? Right?
Sure.
And translating that into something that's useful for a number of different brands. We work with everybody from Warner Brothers to Pepsi to State Farm to, Wells Fargo, right? It's all
Sure.
sort of all over the place. And the fun thing is you kind of get to plug and play different principles, or you can borrow something from the financial industry that works in the hospitality industry, or borrow a theory from education that works in sports. Like it's sort of like this keeping your mind open and this ability to connect dots where they don't normally connect. And so, yeah, we do a number of different initiatives to kind of, I like to say our job is 50% education. And I'm like, hey, here's what's out here and here's what's happening. And the other 50% is activation, like actually turning what we see and what we educate our clients on, and the agency as well, into real life opportunities. I guess one example is the South by Southwest the year before last, when Suicide Squad came out. We actually did, Adweek wrote this up as one of the top 5 experiences at South by that year, which was a real life tattoo parlor. We actually took over the most popular tattoo parlor in Austin and gutted it out and made it look like Belle Rev from where the insane asylum where all the Suicide Squad is kept.
Sure. That's
and
cool.
we were giving away real and temporary tattoos. So it was, we had a line around the block every day. It was just pretty fun, and to actually take the risk and see if people would get real characters tattooed on their bodies, and they did do it. Like free advertising for life for that franchise.
Sure. No, that's really cool. So for people that kind of haven't necessarily heard of you guys, like, let's dive a little bit deeper into kind of some of the stuff you do on more of kind of a daily basis with Ignition Factory.
No day is the same.
Sure, I can imagine.
So I would honestly, I'd say we spend a good 60 to 70% of our time in brainstorms. Like I literally just got out of a brainstorm to do this call.
Okay.
For a Warner Brothers movie.
Sure.
And a lot of it is like, hey, we have this thing. Everybody wants to touch the button, right? You as an individual, you as a podcast host, you're like, how can I make my show stand out more than everybody else?
Sure.
Whether that's through my guests or through things that we do in the marketplace. And so that's, as a media agency, it's all about reach and frequency and transaction at the end of that reach and frequency. And so what are some, for every Pepsi, there's 10 other beverages I might choose from when I walk into the store. So
Sure.
How do I stay top of mind and do things that are impactful? So, it's a lot of sharing links and stuff back and forth, and granted, this is stuff that everybody in the agency can do. It's just that our group is specifically designed for it, and we are given the freedom and the bandwidth to investigate, right?
That's
and
awesome.
to dive deeper. And I think also, it's very specific types of personalities we try to bring on board and types of skill sets, just having this like innate cultural curiosity about how things work or how to change them, not necessarily like, I'll put this lightly, not necessarily like client service per se, and that definitely has its place where you're like, hey, client, what do you need? All right, we're going to dinner. Oh, okay, you want to go to, like, there's definitely the customer service part of it. Our job is to really like push people a little bit outside of their comfort zones, and do things that are sort of unprecedented. So I would say that, yeah, brainstorming, digging around, going to meetings. Einstein, apparently, I don't know if this is true, because there's a lot of Einstein quotes online.
Sure.
Like, he sure did speak a lot. But
he wrote a lot of quotes.
You give me 20. Yeah, exactly. Did you ever actually do any work? No, he said, he allegedly said, if you give me 24 hours to save the world, I'll spend 23 of them asking questions. Right. So
Sure.
It's like anytime a request comes in the door, I'm the annoying guy who's like, well, have you thought about this? What is this? Why do you want to do that? What was that thing? What have you tried? What didn't work? Like, it's 20 questions.
Sure.
And, so it's a little bit of investigation meets exploration.
That's great, man. So You're working on a book. What is the book about, and why did you decide to kind of write about it?
Well, the second question, I ask myself that every day. I was actually up at 4 this morning to turn in my last set of edits to the publisher.
Sure.
So I don't know why I wrote a book, but no, I could.
Did you get asked, or did you pitch it?
It was both. I mean, so I get asked a lot, like, where does innovation come from? What are some of the commonalities you see among your guests? How do you do it, et cetera, et cetera. And like you alluded to earlier, it's like there's a vast number of types and profiles of individuals that have appeared on my show, from adult stars to kids to, astronauts.
Sure.
And they all, but my lens is always, how do you reimagine or reinvent in your domain? Mm-hmm. Right. And, I think that's what we're all striving for, whether you're a parent and you just want to figure out a better way to communicate to your kids. I have a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I'm always like, how can I do this differently so that it sticks?
Yeah.
What do I need to do? I hear you. And so I'm always like, it's just exploring what's the new creative way for me to find a way to resonate with them. But it's the same thing in business. And so, and also I feel like I have a decent point of view and a voice, if you will, which I think goes back to like your podcasting question. It's like, what is your unique position? If you're talking about horse training, like, what's unique about how you do it, right? And I think for me, humor is a big part of, what I do. It's a disarming, trait. So to have somebody in a room who's comfortable because we're having a good time, and then, turn around and they tell me about being molested as a teenager or battling depression or, a number of different like heart-wrenching things I've heard on my show is equally as good as, the keynote like information that comes out of it. So I wanted to combine those two things, and like, innovation is not just a business tactic. It's kind of an expression, right? It's a personal expression. And, and if there's 10 people working on a project, they're all putting a little bit of their personality and their perspective into that thing. And we have to understand like how we operate as human beings in order to also understand how we operate as businesses and idea makers. So, and so hopefully the book, which is called, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Shameless plug. Crushing the Box. 10 essential rules for breaking essential rules. Okay. And these are all sort of thank you. Yeah, these are all just sort of constructs around, what does it take to sort of reimagine successful.
And when can people kind of expect it and actually pick up a copy?
We are doing our debut event on March 11th at South by Southwest.
Very cool.
I grew up in Detroit, as we mentioned earlier, so we're partnered with the Michigan House on this launch. And so come early March, the book will be available on Amazon and on my website at www.thecrush.co.
Perfect, man. No, that's really cool. I love that. Like, I think the thing that I love, and you probably, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, while you love doing your show, is like you get to talk to people that, either had a really good childhood, kind of had a really bad childhood, or everywhere in between, and how they've kind of turned that into kind of a positive thing, right? Like, and I think in some cases the best stories are the ones that maybe had kind of a worse childhood and they've kind of made something positive out of it. And I think that's kind of really inspiring, and having people be able to tell those stories and kind of just let people feel like they're kind of not alone, right? In some of the good and bad struggles that kind of life has to offer is kind of some of the most rewarding people I've had on the show. And it sounds like you're kind of in a similar boat. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yes. I mean, 100%. But like, that was one of the pleasant surprises of doing the show.
Sure. Was
that suddenly I was like, oh, what happened?
Yeah, totally.
Good or bad, or a combination of both.
Sure.
There was a girl, Shira Lazar, who hosts What's Trending, and she's CEO of that company, and this is also a story in the book. But she, they had a huge television deal that they were, going to launch and had be on multiple networks and so on and so forth. and literally like the 11th hour is like the company pulled out.
Wow.
And, you know, for her, it was just devastating. And she was like, I couldn't leave my bedroom for, you know, a couple of weeks.
Sure.
And, you know, and then not only that, she was like, her logical self was like, it's not that bad. There are worse things happening in the world. And so then you get double angry at yourself because you're like, I know I don't need to be as upset about this thing as upset as I am, let alone, you know, just not having the fortitude or the strength to just snap out of it, right? And those are just like those real life moments that happen that you don't necessarily hear about when, you know, Mark Cuban gives a talk at XYZ event, right?
Yeah, totally.
Most platforms are meant to show you the highlight reels of people's lives.
Totally.
Like, and then we created this thing, and then we created that, and then when that didn't work, I told him to shut up, and then he did it anyway. And like, you're in the audience taking notes, and you're like, I guess I could tell him to shut up. But then when you hear that somebody's, I refer to them as B2 moments,
sure,
where it's like, oh, I also struggle with that same thing, or imposter syndrome is huge, or how we talk about like the innovator's journey is a very lonely one, because if you're the only person who sees this opportunity or this business opportunity the way you see it, you know, it takes a lot of like pitching and reworking and like blood, sweat, and tears that we don't necessarily talk about.
No, that's interesting. So I'm curious though, how did you kind of get involved with the Mobile Excellence, Media Excellence Awards? Because obviously like Sarah put us in touch, but how did you kind of get involved with that?
Again, just being nosy.
That's great, man.
I met Sarah at an. I think we met at an event. We had like crossed paths a couple of times, so it was like one of those like, "What's your name again?" Like one of those conversations. And then, you know, a good month later or so, like we were really talking shop and like, all right, here's what you believe, here's what you created. You know, at the time I probably was still involved with Digital Content Lab at AFI.
Okay.
And, you know, just looking at like how mobile is a platform and even looking at the MEA's evolution from the Mobile Excellence Awards to the Media Excellence Awards, right? Like mobile is such just a native a part of how we experience the world for many of us globally. So just really like wanting to help steer. I love, you know, I love when things are at a pivot point, right? I'm not necessarily like, let's build an idea from scratch. But if you tell me a nugget of an idea, I can extrapolate the shit out of that thing. Right? So,
no, it's good though.
And that's what we did. It was just like, oh, have you tried this? What about this resource? And just like, again, my 20 questions became, all right, well, here's some ways I can probably help. And just really seeing like the community that she had already developed. And it was a good group, and you know, and everybody loves to be acknowledged, right? I think you could launch your own award show based on your podcast, and people be like, "Wow, I won an award," and not just diminish the value of an MEA, but it's just like in industry being recognized for effort or a project or anything is like super empowering. So, you know, to give that to people in a realm that nobody else had been thinking about, you know, awarding and acknowledging individuals and companies was pretty smart.
Yeah, no, I that's interesting. I think the funny thing is like just how, like I've had a bunch of people that were kind of at the MEAs and I'm going to continue kind of interviewing people. And it's like, I love finding out kind of how they got involved with, you know, with the whole awards, because everybody kind of has their own kind of unique story, but a lot of it just comes back to just kind of networking at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, and there's no shortage. As a matter of fact, now, as we were talking, I remember where I met Sarah, and it was at the Streamy Awards.
Okay.
It was a whole other, you know, award show, and like kind of based in the digital content space. And it is that, you know, sort of that ability to meet people. And I think, you know, networking is hard, especially as well. I will say in LA it's hard, and as by comparison to some other parts of the world. Because
why do you say that in LA is difficult?
Well, I feel like LA is just by nature a hustle town, right?
Okay.
Like it's Hollywood. Everybody's got a script, or they're, you know, trying to angle into another category of business in some way, shape, or form, or if you are a celebrity and made this your home and you've turned your celebrity into serial entrepreneurship and you have a ton of businesses or ideas, or you're exploring technology, or you own a bakery. Like, everybody's sort of a multi-hyphenate.
Yeah.
So it's always like, you're always angling to some degree. And I think once you and that's not always a bad thing. I don't mean to say that it's a bad thing, but it's different than having an open conversation and not having an agenda.
Yeah,
right?
It's kind of just see where it goes, right?
Right. And I grew up in Michigan. Like, I could go into a bar and then not worry about business whatsoever, because I'm just like, they're throwing darts around or dancing, or like I'm just having a good time. And those conversations become just very organic. How are you doing conversations versus like, what do you do?
Sure. Or what can you do for me kind of conversations, right?
Right. And I think most people, I would say, and there's a couple of like little social nuances I noticed. One is, if in the first 2 or 3 sentences of encountering somebody in an event, and it's like, what do you do? It's like, I don't know if I want to be like, I don't know. It's a hard thing to want to share in that environment, right?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure you've been at events where, you're wearing your name tag and you're walking around, and if your name or your company isn't readily recognizable to somebody, they will move on.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
It's like, I've seen like this scan someone up and down, like, oh, hey, no, I'm going to move over here.
Yeah, like, sure. Yeah.
And it's such an obvious, and we all do it. And it's like, I'm guilty of it as well. But it's kind of a shitty feeling either side of that coin. I'm sorry I keep cussing on your show, but
it's all good.
You have a mute button.
Yep.
But no, it's like, so when anytime you can actually genuinely connect with somebody, and matter of fact, one of my strategic business partners on Innovation Crush, I knew this guy for 2 years. Like, we would just talk, and every time we saw each other, it was just insults. He's Asian, I'm black. It was just racial humor, making fun of each other, maybe talk a little bit about wherever we are. And then finally we're like, I have no idea what you do. We should go and have lunch.
Sure.
And we actually did that. And magically we're like, oh, we should 1,000% be working together. Right.
That's awesome.
So, yeah. So it's a different, just a different entry point. I think that's where networking with too much, deliberate intention can actually backfire, I believe.
No, I 100% agree. I think it's always kind of fascinating when you just like to have, just like meet new people. And sometimes, like, I find if you see somebody's name tag and they work at like a big brand, a lot of times they're just like a small cog into like a big kind of wheel, right? And you're just like, oh, wow, that person was, not all the time, but sometimes you're like, wow, that was kind of boring what they do for a living. Like, I would never want to do that, right? But you're like, but they work at X company, right? But if you meet somebody that's like at a company you've never heard of, and you're like, oh wow, like you're doing some really cool stuff, like let's have a longer conversation about this, right? So I don't know, I guess it can go both ways, but you bring up a really good point. But Chris, sadly we're coming to the end of the show, so let's close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself, the book, the podcast.
Google.
Okay.
The end. No, just kidding. No. So the website for all things, that would be rude if I just said like Google and hung up.
Google it. Yeah.
Google me, B word. No, it's www.thecrush.co.
Okay.
That's all the episodes. There's my weird bio. There's some projects and things we've done via the show. Pretty soon there will be some more solid information about the book. There's actually some hidden Easter eggs on the website. We'll spare you the details on. Everything else is Densonology, kind of like the study of oneself.
Sure.
And so that's Twitter, Instagram, Denson with ology on the end. LinkedIn is a great place to find me. I think, all jokes aside, Googling Ignition Factory we'll actually turn up with some really great examples of projects we've been able to accomplish. I mean, I'm in LA, but I also manage our Midwest team.
Okay.
There's a team in New York. There's a smaller team in Canada. So
sure.
All those teams are doing really amazing stuff and showing up in really interesting places and interesting ways. So I think that's pretty much the gist of where to get all the goods.
Perfect, Chris. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
All right, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man. We'll talk soon.
Yep.
Okay, bye.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit the show's website at buildingthefutureshow.com. Also check us out on Facebook at Building the Future Show and follow us on Twitter at Building Show. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.